Hello, welcome to my week at the club, episode number 20, and I'm bringing you the action from last week's game at the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. that I played against Dave Thomas, and it was a pretty exciting game. You might recall that I had played Dave back in episode number 7, and so I knew it's likely to be an exciting game because in that game he came roaring back with a counterattack against my Benko Gambit. And just to mix things up a little bit this time around, I decided to play a king pawn opening instead of starting out with d4. So I started out with e4, as you can see, and he responded with e5. And I can continue on with a double king pawn standard opening with the knights out. And instead of going to the Ruy Lopez, I went into the Giuoco Piano, or Italian game, giving at least the chance of that. It could also go into a two knights defense. But Dave responded with his bishop to c5, so it's going along the lines of Giuoco Piano. And I castled. He attacked my king pawn with his knight, and rather than the normal Giuoco Piano move here of playing c3, that would start to build up a strong center. Instead, I played what's often called the Giuoco Pianissimo with d3. And interestingly enough, it was a day after the match. It was Game 5 of the World Championship in New York, and Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karyakin went down this very line and got a position after about 10 moves that wasn't too dissimilar to ours. But in this particular position, rather than moving the queen pawn as Dave did, Karyakin actually castled. But Dave, as I said, defended his king pawn. I went ahead and started to support my center, in particular to keep the knight out of this d4 square and to keep any funny business from happening to a pinned knight on f3, but also, more importantly, to support an upcoming thrust of my b pawn. So after Dave castled, I went ahead and played b4, attacking the bishop. Now in that game in New York, they got into a similar position, but it started out with a4 first, and then later on c3 and b4. Dave, of course, has no choice at this point. He has to retreat the bishop to b6, and I went ahead and continued on with a4. This is threatening now to, of course, win the bishop by playing a5. He has to do something about that threat. There are two choices, really. One is to play the pawn to a6 in response to make a escape square on a7, and the other is to counterattack and make an escape square by playing all the way to a5, which is what he did. Rather than try to defend that pawn there, which I suppose would have been a possibility, I went ahead and pushed my b pawn. And the reason was that I wanted to drive his knight away from control of the center. Of course, what it really is going to do is to allow him to transfer his knight over to the king side, but I knew that going in. And I actually had thought at the time a bit about playing bishop to g5 here, establishing a pin on these two knights. And now, in order to keep me from hurting his pawn structure, he would have to do something. I suppose he could retreat this f knight, but that doesn't appeal to me too much because the remaining knight there is pinned, although a central thing here is that because of the pressure of my bishop along this diagonal and the absolute pin of this f pawn of Dave's, he can't push it to drive my bishop away. So it's hard to actually break this pin. So another possibility, if I had played bishop to g5, would have been for him to continue on with the knight to g6. And then the thing I didn't like about this is that after some move on my part, say I just developed my knight, he could attack my bishop, and now that effectively is going to break the pin because I can't afford to come back here unless I'm willing to let his knight trade off my bishop. And so either I exchange my bishop for one of his knights or I fall back with my bishop at that point. So I didn't want to go down that line. So instead, after knight to e7, I just put my bishop on e3. And the nice aspect of this is that it neutralizes that force of his bishop along that dark square diagonal, which is kind of a bit of a thorn in my side at this point. It also is threatening, of course, to play bishop takes bishop. And if I did that right now, then he would have to retake with the pawn, and this would give him a very weakened pawn structure on his queen side. So he doesn't want to allow that to happen, and what he did was to play c5 immediately. Now, of course, I have the choice to either capture en passant and renew the threat of taking his bishop, although, of course, now his queen could take back, or I could leave the position as it is, the pawn structure. I decided to leave the pawn structure as it is. It's got some advantages for me. The dark squares, in particular, are all going to hem in this bishop that he has on b6. And there's a nice hole here on d5 if I can ever manage to maneuver around and plunk down a knight or even possibly just the bishop on that square. Right now I don't want to do it because he has he could just trade it off easily with one of his knights, but that won't last forever. So overall I sort of like this position, and I was still thinking about possibly moving on the king side, although the queen side is pretty locked up, and now that the center is locked up, we're both going to be interested in attacking on the king side. So I went ahead and developed my knight through d2, and he continued transferring his knight over the king side. And then I played queen to b3. I was kind of at a loss for moves here, and so this move from d1 to b3 is, it's got some things going for it, but it maybe has more going against it than for it. It moves my queen away from defense of my king side. It takes over absolute control of this diagonal. The principal thing I wanted to do at this point was to prevent him developing his bishop through e6. And I didn't see a nice other square for him to develop the bishop to, because he has some of the same problems trying to pin my knight as I had pinning his knight. So that's why I did it. I'm not sure it was a good move. The computer's not too fond of it. He went ahead and played his queen to e7 to continue on with his development, and also possibly in the future here to support the bishop coming to e6. So I put my rook on the same file as his queen, because you never know when although intervening pawns will go away in a nice little combination. It's a useful square to have your rook on, as I've said before. And he played h6 to stop me from changing my mind and going ahead and making a pin, or also to stop me from playing the knight up to g5, taking away that square from me. I continued on with my idea of centralizing my rooks on the two middle files, and he played king to h7, and this sort of signaled to me that he's interested in moving this f-pawn to f5 at some point, and he wanted to get it off, his king off of the diagonal, so that the pawn was no longer pinned. Okay, I decided it was a good time to open up the center before he could get really too organized on the king side, and played d4, which can lead to some interesting tactics. Well, I guess it was interesting. It didn't go quite down the line I was expecting. I thought that, for example, one thing that might happen here would be for the pawns to get exchanged. I might as well turn the engine on here so we can see what's happening. Okay. Sorry. So after d4 and he played knight g4 instead. If he had played c takes d4 like that, then you can see white still has an advantage. I was going to take back, and at this point I didn't analyze knight g4, which is what the engine's calling for. I was looking more at the line of him taking my pawn, me taking back, and now he has this e-pawn attack twice. Now, I could have, actually, in fact, I was planning to take back with the bishop at that point. And that would then allow me to have my e-pawn defended. It's not clear which one is better, as you can see. They're both kind of comparable. This taking with the knight is a little more subtle because now it looks like this pawn is being lost, but the queen really can't afford to take on e5. So if he played knight takes, I take back with the knight, and he plays queen takes, then this bishop gets a free move because of the discovered attack on the queen. And I've traded that e-pawn, opened up a file for my rooks, and gotten his pawn in front of his king taken away. So that obviously is an advantageous line for white. We'll go back. Let me turn off the engine a bit. Okay, so after I played d4, he instead played knight to g4, which is an interesting move. But I had a very nice response, or at least I felt it was a nice response to that, to play my knight to f1. And now if he continues on to take that bishop, which is what he did do, then I can simply take back with my knight, and now it's headed to this hole on d5. So I've managed to make a little knight maneuver with that knight that was on d2 to e3, which is now going to go to d5, which is, I think, to my advantage. He went ahead and continued on, putting his bishop to try to neutralize the force along that diagonal. But now I have, I wouldn't call it a combination, but a sequence of moves that gives white some advantage here. So I played pawn takes pawn. I'm going to be able to force him either to, if he takes knight takes, to have him take back with the pawn, or take with the pawn immediately. He took with the knight, and so then I traded off the knights, and now his pawn is, that pawn is on e5. And the problem is that now I can just go ahead and, well, I have a couple of choices. What I actually had originally been looking at this point was the idea of probably taking on e6 with my bishop, like so. Let me move this window up a bit here. And after that, f takes, he has doubled pawns that I could work against. And so, you know, that pawn on e5 especially is a real target. And white can continue attacking that. And there's, I should point out that not only is this pawn being attacked, but also the bishop is too. And the bishop could retreat and also defend the pawn at the same time. And it's true that white could attack it, but he could always fall back and defend it from b8. Although now that's sort of awkward because this rook that's on a8 is hemmed in. The computer instead in this position actually suggests bishop to d8. And the problem then is that this knight will fall. If the knight didn't fall, if he played the other move, bishop to b8, defending this knight, or defending the pawn rather, on e5, then white could continue with the queen up to b5, and now this pawn on a5 is very hard to defend because it's attacked twice, knight and the queen. So white's getting a lot of play here. I didn't do this. Instead, I played my knight into d5 instead of doing those exchanges because it just felt strong to me. I was, it's forking the bishop and the queen, and there are only a couple ways to move that queen that defend the bishop, and they both involve discovered attacks with the knight. I mean, he could either come to, well, just color the square here, could either come to d6 or d8, and either one of those defend the bishop, but they're in line with my rook. It turns out the best move here, and the one that I was really most worried about during the game, was simply to trade off the knight. So if he had played bishop takes knight, then I don't really have any fantastic choice here. I could play pawn takes. It's a passed pawn, but it would be could become a target of attack, and it's easy for him to blockade it and maybe gang up on that pawn. Also, it's bishops of opposite color if I do that. If I take back with my bishop, that's probably my best bet at this point would be to take with a bishop, and it's well placed there, but it's not clear, what my plan is from this point on. It's just a nice position for white. If I took back with my rook, which is what I was probably intending to do, it really doesn't lead anywhere because the black I can't maintain the d file. I'm not really claiming it. Black has this d8 square firmly under control with the bishop, the queen, and the rook. And so even though I could double up my rooks, he can still just exchange, for example, take a rook now, trade a pair of rooks off, and then play another rook over to that open file. And what am I going to do? There's no way to avoid the exchanges. So that would have really relieved the pressure for him. But instead he put his queen on d8, which was a happy sight for me to see, because right away I started looking for discovery possibilities with this knight. So, the obvious move here is to play knight to f6 check, and you'd like to win the queen, but of course, unfortunately, the queen could just recapture on f6. So that doesn't do it. I can take the bishop, and that attacks the queen, but the queen can take back. I could play the knight back here to e3, for example, but he could just trade off, could take my bishop, attacking my queen. And now, if you work through the various possible trades in this position, none of them lead to a material advantage for white. So none of those things are really what I was looking for. So instead, I looked at the position and recognized that I've got a nice situation. I'll just sit on it. Black is really not in a position where I can make moves very easily. So instead, I just improved my position here with h3. And the idea is just to make Luft for my king, so give it an escape square on h2, because some of these possibilities where there were trades on the d file may end up with me not wanting to be pinned down to my back rank. And, after I play my queen up, if he... I won't go back through the sequence, but there was a sequence of trades with rooks where he would end up actually then playing the queen to d8. And at that point, if I didn't want to move my queen off the file, I could exchange, but if I moved the queen off the file, then he would actually have a back rank mate threat at that point. So that's why I made Luft at this juncture. Okay, as I said, he doesn't have too much in the way of moves to make. He supported his bishop on e6, which is good because in some of these variations it would keep me from doubling the pawns on e6. I went ahead and improved my rook's positions. Now the idea here, of course, is this rook lift is very flexible. It can come over here to the king side on either f3 or g3 and start to look at these pawns on the king side, or I can double up rooks with this move. So I was sort of happy with that one. At that point, he played his king back to h8. I'm not sure what the purpose behind that move was, but you do have to make some move. And I went ahead and doubled my rooks. Okay, at that point, Dave played his rook to c8. And so now it's actually time for me to embark upon a maneuver that allows me to penetrate his position. I trade off my knight for his bishop on b6, and now with the rooks doubled, I can play rook to d6. And he has to move his queen somewhere, and I can, at a minimum, win a pawn here on e6 because I've got to attack 3 times with my rook, bishop, and queen. Okay, he retreated the queen to a7, possibly c7 would have been a little better. Now at this point I maybe should have taken a timeout to attack his queen, but I really didn't want to push it onto the b8 square. But the computer actually likes that square a little better, likes this position a little better for white, mainly because the white's queen then gets access to the white squares and can penetrate in the position. Maybe not immediately on this move, but that's the sort of advantage that you get from it. But I didn't do that. Instead, what I did was to go ahead and trade the bishops off on e6, and he took back with the pawn. If he takes back with the rook, I'll immediately trade rooks, and he'll have to take back with the pawn, and that pawn is even easier for me than to attack and win. So now I have it attacked twice, but there's a little issue here, and that's that if it's white's move, and I could, seemingly just go ahead and win this pawn, but black would have the response of playing c4, and now all of a sudden I'm losing my rook because my queen is cut off from defending the rook. So I couldn't really afford to take that pawn immediately. And so instead what I did was to play this move of queen to c4, which is a cute little move that holds that c pawn in place and keeps it from blocking the support of my queen on this pawn. Notice pushing the pawn here wouldn't do any good because even though that fixes the black pawn on c5, it also keeps my queen from attacking e6, so I'm no longer threatening to win that immediately. It's still a target, but I'm not threatening to win it. So instead, I played my queen to c4. He played his pawn up to b6, which is a good move. It allows the queen to defend, to be active here along the 7th rank. I can't just penetrate with my rook because he could then block with his rook. Although, I suppose I could play rook to e8, but then he could play his other rook to back to c8, and I don't want to repeat that position. I'm not really getting anywhere. So instead, I went ahead and took the pawn at this point, and the rook is not in danger of getting pinned by the queen, I should point out, because if he did that, I could just take with check. And to keep from losing the queen, he'd just have to take back with the queen, and now I'm just a clear pawn to the good. He has no f pawn, and I do. So that's not a defense. So I went ahead and took the pawn, and he played his queen to c7. Okay, I doubled my rooks up again to make them stronger and to threaten to set up this penetration to the 7th rank now that his queen is on c7. And he played his rook over to d8. Now, at this point, I could trade 2 pairs of rooks if I wanted to, but his queen would end up on d8. And even though I don't have to worry about that back rank mate anymore, I still didn't want to go into just a queen and pawn endgame because they're kind of tricky. Even though I was a pawn ahead, lots of times the queens, the more active queen is a more important consideration than actually being 1 pawn ahead in the position. And he would have had activity along the d file in that situation. So instead I tripled along the d file, which then threatens to win that rook on d8 outright and forces him to initiate the trade or yield the file to me. And if it yielded the file here, I would have played rook to d7 and would have had a very strong attack. In fact, that would have been deadly. If he played like rook c8, I could play rook d7. The queen has to go somewhere, like to b8, and then I play queen f7, threatening checkmate, and he has to come over and defend. This is not a position he wanted. In fact, I could maybe even end up tripling along the d file after attacking the queen and then bringing with the rook and then bringing my other rook up. So that would have been no fun at all for black. So instead he traded off a pair of rooks. I took back with my queen, and I was really hoping that at this point he would trade queens on using the old maxim that all rook endgames are drawn. But I really think this would have been very bad for him if he traded queens at this point, because I take with my rook, and now his rook has no way to get active immediately, and I'm threatening to take this b pawn. And if he just comes over and passively defends the b pawn, well, for one thing, I can come and attack the e pawn right away. I don't have to. What I probably would have done was to centralize my king first to take over control of the d file penetration squares. See, if I did it immediately, then he could get an active rook out of it. And even though this is maybe very good for white because I'm getting this passed b pawn, he still has possibilities here with the rook coming, winning my pawn, and then getting behind my passed pawn. But if instead I prepared that move, I mean, he can't really do anything here. I could just start centralizing my king. He could centralize his. And if I wait one more move, it would be too long. So I would attack his pawn at this point. If he tried to take over the file, then I would play my king to e2. And now he's going to lose the e pawn on the next move. And his rook can't penetrate my position. So that was the kind of endgame I was hoping for. Instead, he played the queen to b7. And let's see, move 30. Okay, I had stopped keeping track of the times at this point. A couple moves ago, I had 10 moves left and he had 20 moves left for the game. So I was at a 2-to-1 time disadvantage, and I was really hoping that these queens would come off easily. His queen, I should point out here, is attacking my e pawn. I have to do something about that threat, and what I chose to do was to bring my rook up into a place where it not only blocks the attack on the e pawn, but also gives a double attack on his e pawn. He came over. There's not much you can do about that. He came over with his queen to get it active, and problem with that is I take the b pawn, but now he at least gets into my position with queen f4. And at this point, the game was starting to get a little frantic for both of us. I was running shorter on time than he was for several more moves, but of course I have a better position, but I don't want to fall prey to a perpetual check of the queen in my position. So fortunately I was able to take this c pawn on this move, and the important thing here is that taking this pawn now is allowing me to defend my f pawn, because after he comes down check and my king moves over and he checks me on the dark square diagonal, I don't want to have a perpetual check, so I need to play pawn up, and now you can see why it's important that this f pawn is defended. However, he does get to take my e pawn there, so he got a pawn back in the deal, but I have this very dangerous passed b pawn that I could do something about. So in order to try to set up a little maneuver, actually this is a point that I stopped keeping track of my game score. I had 3 minutes left on the clock, and he had, I think, about he was also down to about 4 minutes at that point, 3 or 4 minutes, because he stopped keeping score at the same time I did, or maybe even 1 or 2 moves earlier. You're allowed to not keep score after you get under 5 minutes. Now this game, time control is game in 100 minutes, so you have to play all your moves in 100 minutes, but we both used 97 of those minutes. And the additional wrinkle is that you get 5 seconds delay before your clock starts ticking down time each time it's your move. So if you can make your move within 5 seconds, no time comes off your clock. But 5 seconds goes by awfully quickly, you'd be surprised. So we were both losing time on our clocks with pretty much each move we make. It's a complicated position because there are a lot of, you have to worry about various checks and forks and pins and other kinds of little tactical motifs that can happen here. So with this move, I attacked his rook, and I also set up a discovered attack on the queen, a potential discovered attack. I mean, it looks like I went into a self-pin, but as you'll see, it's not so dangerous. So he played his rook over to this square where he was attacking my f-pawn, thinking that maybe the next move he would play rook takes f2 check, and then it's me who's getting checkmated. But I have the strong response here of queen to d8. And now this forces the rooks off, because if he were to just go ahead and take my rook, then I would win his queen. If he takes my queen, I would take the rook check, his king would have to move, and then I play pawn takes queen. So he would lose material either way under those scenarios. So he has no choice but to allow a rook trade after I do this. And so he recognized that and defended his rook with the queen, and I went ahead and traded the rooks off. And now I'm just down to this pure queen and pawn endgame, but literally with under a minute left on the clock, and time was getting very short for both of us. I played the king to g2 to protect that f-pawn that he had under attack. And now he played kind of a nice subtle move here of queen to f5, and the threat is to advance this pawn to e4, now that he's protecting it with the queen, and then the queen can come in check and end up getting a perpetual check. The moves were, both of us were trying to get our moves out quickly, and fairly shortly after this, Dave was down to about 4 or 5 seconds, and I was watching his clock, and it seemed like each move he would use about 6 seconds, which took 1 second off of his clock. And so his clock was going down very slowly, and got to 1 second after a few more moves here. I played my queen back to stop that threat of him advancing the pawn, and to offer a queen trade, which of course he refused. The other thing is that he's controlling the advance of my b pawn. I don't have the square protected, so I can't advance it yet. But I went ahead and checked the king, and then moved my c pawn to support the b pawn, since there was nothing stopping me from doing that. He moved his e pawn in hopes that at one point he could get his queen into that f6 square, or f3 square rather. I checked, and I should say the other thing is that he had probably visions of maybe pushing the e pawn and opening up the second rank so he could check me laterally with the queen, or pinning the pawn with the queen and the pawn and winning it, or there are all sorts of nasties that could happen. Instead, I checked, and now that after the king moves, the pawn is pinned to his queen. So I'm able to advance my c pawn again. He got off of that diagonal, but he's not threatening anything right here. So I went ahead and took his pawn. He was no longer defending it. He attacked my c pawn. I advanced it. Okay, so these moves are not great. It got down to where we were both playing with a few seconds on the clock, and it's a wonder that neither one of us made a bad blunder. He went ahead to try to stop the advance of the b pawn again. I offered the trade of queens. He moved away. I put my king onto a safer, I'm in check here, and by putting my king on h2, it's on a square where it's awkward for him to get at the king as long as I keep this f2 square guarded by my queen. So my idea was just to keep my queen along this diagonal, and it would allow me to guard my f2 square, and then he wouldn't be able to come in with checks on the king. He made a quick move. I was able to reposition my queen again with check, and since he's not threatening to take that pawn immediately, I went ahead and played my queen to where it would support my c pawn's advance. He moved his queen. He probably should have played it to c2 at this point, and then that would have necessitated me coming back. I would probably have played over here to defend my e-pawn so that he can't come after my king. But he didn't do that. He went to c3 instead, but that allows me just to push my c-pawn. He then moved to a square where he had this c-pawn under observation. So I moved my king over to defend it. He moved his queen again, just making a quick move. So these are moves made with 1 second on his clock. It was driving me nuts watching that clock and looking at my clock that had 8 seconds, 6 seconds, 5 seconds, 4 seconds. So I got a second queen. He checked me. I moved away to that safe square. He went ahead and took the pawn. It doesn't really matter too much where he goes. I was able to check him at that point, and he only has one legal move at this point, and next move is checkmate. So it turned out, when I looked at the clock, said he still had 1 second left. I had 3 seconds on my clock, and so it's a wonder that game didn't end with the clock, but instead it was actually decided by checkmate. It was a pretty exciting game. I was happy with it overall. I missed the idea that it would have been stronger to go ahead in that middle game and just trade off on d5, or on e6. Instead of playing my knight in here to d5, which looked like a very strong post, instead to go ahead and go into this bishop takes e6 line, which would have given him enough weaknesses that I could have maneuvered against to have given me a good game, and I'd still end up winning a pawn that way. But fortunately for me, I didn't get hurt too badly. White was never worse, but white, was not in nearly as good a position as it would have been otherwise. So, fun game. It was the 5th round. I ended up 5th and final round. I ended up in 2nd place. Brett Kildall won a half a point ahead of me, and there was actually a 5-way tie for 2nd place. So there were a number of us that were also Rands, or almost Rands, or whatever you want to call it, that didn't quite finish in the money. And not that there's any money, but anyhow, didn't finish with a gold medal. So until next week, so we're skipping a week because of the Thanksgiving holiday, so until the game about a week from now, this is Roger Capello saying goodbye, and have fun studying your chess.